Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. Just as Pakistan continues to make efforts to draw international attention to the Kashmir issue, including the speech by Nawaz Sharif at the United Nations, India has now stepped up its campaign to counter Pakistan, reminding Pakistan that it is not the UN resolutions on Kashmir that the world is interested in, but Pakistan's compliance on the numerous UN resolutions to battle terrorism.
हम सबका साझा संकल्प है कि विश्व शांतिपूर्ण हो.
After raising the pitch for time-bound reforms at the United Nations, Prime Minister Modi moved on to making the most of his US visit, while his Pakistani counterpart Nawaz Sharif made yet another predictable speech to a largely disinterested audience at the UN General Assembly. It is apparent that Pakistan's military brass, its hawkish media and the public in general would have been unforgiving if Nawaz Sharif had not brought up the Kashmir issue at the UN. Once again, Sharif tried to portray his country as a victim rather than sponsor of terrorism.
Pakistan is a primary victim of terrorism. We have lost thousands of lives, including civilians and soldiers, to terrorist violence.
India was not only unwilling to buy this oft-repeated Pakistani line, but Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj minced no words as she reminded Pakistan of its deep-rooted relationship with terror.
वो राष्ट्र जो आतंकवादियों को आर्थिक मदद देते हैं, उनको सुरक्षित ठिकाने उपलब्ध करवाते हैं, उन्हें प्रशिक्षण देते हैं, उन्हें हथियार मुहैया कराते हैं या उनके अभियानों में उन्हें सहायता देते हैं, अंतर्राष्ट्रीय समुदाय को ऐसे राष्ट्रों के खिलाफ खड़ा होना पड़ेगा.
An Indian government dossier states that the Jaish-e-Mohammed that was responsible for the attack on the Indian Parliament in 2001 is operating a terror camp in Chelabandi in Muzaffarabad. And the Hizbul Mujahideen, another key insurgent group in Jammu and Kashmir, trains at Khalid bin Walid in Muzaffarabad. That apart, the ISI is supporting 7 terrorist sanctuaries and training facilities inside Muzaffarabad and the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa area, such as those in Sensa, Kotil, Dungi and Gulpur. But it is in the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir region that the Pakistani Establishment's current favourite and the group behind the 26/11 Mumbai attacks, the Lashkar-e-Toiba, is most active, with training camps spread across the area. Much of this data has been authenticated by satellite imagery obtained from Western intelligence agencies. And even though the ISI and the Pakistani army informally claim that they are only providing technical assistance, Indian officials say that terrorist strikes against India will continue to occur unless these sanctuaries are closed down.
To look at in great detail what the Lashkar-e-Toiba is all about, what its agenda is, how it gets its support and training from the Pakistani deep state, we have with us a very special guest, Professor Stephen Tankhill, who is currently with the School of International Studies at the American University and also with the Center for New American Security, and most importantly, is the author of a very well-researched book on the Lashkar-e-Toiba and its history. Professor Tankhill, my first question: do you really believe that Pakistan's deep state, the military and intelligence agencies, have all the resources available to them to continue to protect the Lashkar-e-Toiba when their top leadership is now on the global radar as recognized terrorists?
My sense is, first, that Lashkar-e-Toiba continues to enjoy, and I think this is relatively clear, sanctuary in Pakistan, and I don't think that that's much in dispute. And it is, as you noted, one of the more reliable groups for the Pakistan Army and ISI. And there are no indications that that relationship is changing anytime soon. In terms of the resources necessary, I think it's also important to note that the group is relatively self-sufficient at this stage, whereas in the past it was a question of building Lashkar-e-Toiba and its front organizations up. Now it is a question of not tearing them down. So this is really more about continuing to provide that sanctuary, diplomatic protection in certain areas, things of that nature, as opposed to needing to sustain the organization.
Well, you talked about in your book the fact is that the LET has two defining dualities. One is pretending to be a missionary organization, and they do a certain amount of good work on Pakistan's borders with India, particularly in the aftermath of the earthquake in Pakistan, and enjoy a huge amount of popularity. Some would say they've taken a quasi-governmental role in those regions. The other is the militant activity of the Lashkar-e-Toiba, most notably the 26/11 attacks, which was clearly their coming out party, as it were. Therefore, how do you feel that the Pakistani deep state see them in the long term? Do you feel at some stage they'll begin to bite the hand that has fed them all along?
Well, first, let me state, I think one of the things that, in retrospect, if I were to do the book now that I would do differently, is this idea that the group enjoys deep popularity across the country. In point of fact, it probably enjoys deep popularity among certain segments of the population, but I think probably I and others have done a disservice by suggesting that that popularity is as broad as I might have done in the book. That's not to say that they don't have support in certain quarters. It is to say that this is not an organization that is popular across Pakistan. In terms of questions about whether the security establishment needs to fear the Lashkar-e-Taiba, my sense is that there is right now at least some debate and discourse about what can be done about Lashkar in the future. There are those who see it as still a reliable instrument against India. I think there are others who fear the potential for it to grow out of control at some point, if it hasn't already, certainly in terms of domestic reach and capabilities. And whenever Pakistan takes steps against the group, they will face challenges. And I would argue that there are increasingly two things that account for ongoing, passive and in various cases active support for the group. One is that external utility that I mentioned against India. But the other is the concerns about blowback internally of going after the group, as well as the fact that Lashkar-e-Taiba not only provides external utility against India, but it also provides internal utility against some of the other insurgents waging jihad against the Pakistani state. Right?
You also argue that the Lashkar-e-Toiba, for many international observers, could be taking the place of the Al-Qaeda, or to that extent could become a kind of extension of Al-Qaeda's agenda in certain parts of the world. But as yet, the track record shows that they have only been very active in Kashmir, in other parts of India. And one or two incidents when Mr. Modi was being sworn in, apparently we were informed in India through very informed sources abroad that the LET was behind the attacks in some of the Indian consulates and diplomatic presence in Afghanistan. So really, if you look at it, they're still a South Asia organization. Do you think they have ambitions and potentials to become an international organization?
So I should clarify, I did not try to argue or position the group as tipped to succeed Al-Qaeda. As a matter of fact, I argued the opposite, which was that the group has the capabilities, but has not expressed the intention to do so. And in point of fact, part of that is because of its relationship to the Pakistani state. Al-Qaeda operates on the global stage in a way that it is in opposition to a host of different regimes, including the Pakistani state, whereas Lashkar is in some ways restrained by the fact
but
that
the Al-Qaeda also had protection of the Pakistani state, as we saw in the case of bin Laden.
So I have yet to see evidence of, firm evidence of support to Al-Qaeda or bin Laden from the Pakistani state. I think that's a subject of debate, and it's one that I'm sure we could spend the entire show on, although I think it's probably more useful for us to stay on the Lashkar-e-Taiba rather than speculating about what Pakistan was or was not doing with bin Laden. To come back to LET, my sense is, again, do they have the capabilities to act globally? Yes. But they have been restrained by their relationship with the state. I think that is likely to continue for the foreseeable future, although it could change at some stage. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that they are tipped to become the next Al-Qaeda. That said, could they operate globally, and have we seen indications of more international adventurism from the group? Yes, we have, although they have been sporadic. For the most part, this primarily remains a group that, although it could act globally, is focused regionally. And okay. I would add, for Al-Qaeda, the United States is the #1 enemy. For Lashkar-e-Taiba, it's still India.
Interesting. But going back again to their relationship with the Pakistani military and intelligence agencies, your book has a chapter on ISI's boys. You've quoted sources saying that they used to often sit in on briefings together. You've talked about, in great detail, how they were trained and armed for doing the Mumbai attacks. You know, all this evidence did lead to the Lashkar-e-Taiba operating out of Pakistan and having certain patrons and assistants. What is it then that is stopping the world from putting greater pressure, particularly the United States, on the ISI and the Pakistani military and for their linkages with the Lashkar-e-Taiba?
First, I would say, Lashkar-e-Taiba has been a threat to India for a long time, and I think India has struggled with how to calibrate pressure on the Pakistani state. And I think that's probably something that, the United States, struggles with as well. I would also note, however, that the United States has pressed Pakistan to restrain the Lashkar, especially since Mumbai. And the United States has taken a number of other steps as well against Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jamaat-ud-Dawa, individuals within the group. But the fact of the matter is, this is a group that has been around for a long time and has enjoyed, support from Pakistani state for a long time. And ultimately, dismantling the Lashkar-e-Taiba, if it happens, is going to take many, many, many years, and it's going to take a number of shifts by various actors in Pakistan. And as yet, we haven't necessarily seen evidence that they are prepared to take those steps.
Interesting. We'll be back after a break to look at how the Lashkar-e-Taiba came about and how it sustains itself in Pakistan outside of the known support that they get from the Pakistani deep state. Welcome back. We are continuing our discussion with Professor Stephen Tankel from the Center for New American Security in the United States and the author of a very deeply researched book on the Lashkar-e-Taiba. Professor Tankel, my next question is, while the founding of the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Markaz-ul-Dawa and then eventually the Jamaat-ud-Dawa, which is a new name that was given to them, when it became, as you've said, sort of pretty well known that Americans were going after the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and they were forewarned into making a different alignment. So therefore, to what extent is the funding to these institutions available from the state, and is that enough for their sustenance, or they need to raise money by continuing to do dramatic acts across the border and show that the money is being well spent in Kashmir and elsewhere?
Well, I mean, you noted a number of the different places where the money is coming from: schools, hides. I would also add they are invested in industry for some time. You've also got people who've come up through the organization. Maybe they went to an Adawa school. Maybe they did some training, who are wealthy members of society who will give money. So there's a number of different outlets domestically before you even get into money that's coming from the Gulf as well. It's very, very difficult, I think, in the open source to be able to slice and dice exactly where all the different funds are coming from and percentages and things like that. Although my sense overall is that, at least the majority of their funding probably comes domestically. And again, although some money may be coming from the state, the organization has done a very good job of diversifying so that it can raise money. And so this is more a question of not placing restraints on it than necessarily giving it cash to help it keep operating. Do large-scale attacks help, boosts in terms of fundraising? Yes, they certainly do. I mean, there was, reportage, and I've spoken with people in the organization who said they got, a big boost in fundraising after the 2008 Mumbai attacks. But they've done a very good job of making sure that they're not the proverbial shark in the water, right? They don't have to keep moving in order to not to die. They've got money coming in from a lot of different areas. My sense is there are probably there are probably conflicts sometimes in the organization over how that money is spent. You can always have more, but they're certainly not paupers.
Right. You've also said that in Musharraf's time, that relationship went through somewhat of a strain, which they've had built up with the Pakistani establishment because of the new definition of good jihadis and bad jihadis. But simultaneously, there was the recognition within many hardliners of the Pakistani intelligence agencies, but this was one group that could help them get Kashmir more than anybody else. Has that now been reconciled in the Pakistani establishment? Or is there still a divide between some who believe that these guys are now a complete embarrassment around our neck, and some who believe that this is really your vanguard into Kashmir?
I think it's the latter. I think those divisions remain. Those divisions remain within the security establishment over whether people who see the group as potentially constraining Pakistan's foreign policy because of its behavior, those who see it as a potential future internal threat, those who see it as still useful against India, those who see it as useful against the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan and other insurgents, those who are afraid of taking action against the group that could lead to blowback either throughout the country or against them in particular. Those same debates probably are taking place in the organization. There are those who are more committed to missionary outreach and trying to Islamize the Pakistani state. There are those who are more committed to militancy against India. There are those who've been fighting in Afghanistan for however many years and probably are committed to militancy against the United States or other Western actors as well. So the establishment in Pakistan is not uniform. The group is not uniform.
Briefly, your last answer would be, what steps can be taken by the international community along with India to at least get Hafiz Saeed and Zikur Lakman Lakwi, who are both recognized as global terrorists? How do you get them to face the long arm of the law?
So Lakvi was facing justice for some time. He was held in prison for a long period of time. He's since been released. I think...
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, he had a pretty good time in prison. He even fathered a child there.
Fair enough. But anyway, I think pressing to try to get that trial back on track is certainly something, that the international community should be doing, because you had people who were on trial, and trying to get that trial back on track, I think, is a very good start. Hafiz Saeed is obviously more of a challenge. I know that's something that India has been focused on for some time. I think it's helpful to take a step back, though, and ask not just how to get these two individuals to face justice, but also to ask, how does this end? What are the different pathways that we might take? And this is going to be a long road. And this is, I think, a question that India needs to ask itself as well, and certainly the United States also. What is a palatable end to this if we can achieve it? Is it mainstreaming an element of the group through Jamaat-ud-Dawa and dealing with irreconcilables? Is it, trying to get the Pakistani state to break entirely with Lashkar-e-Taiba? That's probably unlikely while it's facing, insurgent threats from a host of other militants, and while people still see it as having potential utility against India. I think these are some of the broader questions that we need to ask. What are the pathways by which this group ends as a militant organization? And to me, that's a question that there's going to be no answer that is satisfactory to everybody. But that is the bigger issue for me, rather than just sort of one individual.
Interesting. A lot of interesting points have been highlighted by Professor Tankil, especially about how Lashkar-e-Toiba could pan out in the future. To sum up some of those points, it is clearly, even now, Pakistan's strongest proxy against India, with very strong links with the military establishment, especially the ISI. Eventually, the organization will continue to focus on India and Kashmir, where it has a track record of success as a terrorist group in the past, and it would remain essentially, as indications are, a regional organization, not necessarily like the Al-Qaeda, which has a very clear anti-American agenda. However, the Pakistani establishment, interestingly, as per Professor Tankl, is now divided on how they should deal with the Lashkar-e-Toiba and other terror groups, and to what extent they should allow them to further their agenda, or should they be constrained. These are challenges which require India to sit down and look at a long-term policy vis-a-vis the Lashkar-e-Toiba and take the support of the international community, because the US is also still looking for answers. Thank you very much for being with us on this show. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, goodbye.